Hello and welcome to Easynomics. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Business Today television, and with me today is Dr. Aurodeep Nandi, the India economist and Vice President at Nomura, India. Welcome to the show. Aurodeep, the backdrop for the conversation really from a consumer and retail point of view is the rather sharp spike that has been witnessed in temperatures across many states. And in the north particularly, it's not just the spike, but it is the early sort of summer that has bothered some people. The weather gods are very important to India's economy, especially for the monsoon outlook. And while we had been expecting that inflation would come further under control, the early signs of a hot summer could prove to be difficult and cloud the outlook for inflation. We also know that the MPC in the minutes that have been released is basically saying that inflation remains high and it would be premature to lower the guard. The finance ministry has also hinted towards some concerns. Come in on this debate to start our conversation by telling us how do you read the situation at the moment?
Well, Siddharth, I think this is, of course, a matter of concern, and it's also something that we are monitoring, right? So it's very difficult, notoriously difficult, in fact, to predict how the weather is going to be. If things deteriorate, the question is, will this impact wheat output? And just some of the noise one hears around is that policymakers are taking this quite seriously. In fact, I think recently there was news that the government isn't really looking to reverse the ban on wheat exports. Mind you, I mean, we had a tough year for cereals last year. Not only was there an issue on the output side, we also had the Russia-Ukraine war that jacked up prices. And we also had the additional free food program by the government. So any Indian under the normal PDS system gets 10 kilos of wheat, rice, and some grains, which he or she can buy at subsidized prices. On the top of that, the government was giving 5 kilo of additional free food grains, right? Which meant that the inventories for wheat came really under pressure. And because then the government started substituting wheat for rice in the PDS system, rice inventories came under pressure. So it's actually been a pretty tough year for cereals, come to think of it, the year that just went by. So the government has discontinued the free food program, right? So the additional free food program, and the current subsidized program is made into a free one. So they are trying to bring the inventory situation under control. In such a situation, if the heat wave indeed strikes and the wheat crop gets hit, and then there is an upside risk on inflation. The other point which Siddharth, I think is worth mentioning is also the impact on the growth side, because if the wheat crop is hit and if other crops get hit, this will hit rural demand, right? And one of the things which you've seen, say, in the corporate results that came out recently, especially of FMCG companies, has been that the rural economy still remains a weak spot in the consumption story. So the key question, I guess, that what one needs to ask is that if indeed agri output suffers next year, then will that impact also not just inflation, but also on the growth side?
So the question that I have is, at the moment, given all the indications and data available, do you think India's agriculture output, particularly of staples, is likely to come under pressure because of adverse weather conditions that may build up?
So, Siddharth, again, it's difficult to say because this is not the first time India has had adverse weather conditions. It's not the first time we are talking of heat wave at this time of the years. So it's happened in the past, and one would think that a lot of Indian farmers are also getting somewhat better at managing these climatic risks. So at this point, I think it's very difficult to say for sure what would turn up, and a lot will depend, of course, on how bad the weather really turns, or whether this is this sort of passes without damaging too much of crops.
Uh, holy time, there are, because the date keeps changing. There used to also be a time when people would ask whether Holi this year would be, would it be easy to play a wet Holi, get wet on Holi, because the water is pretty cold, at least in the north of India. This time there are no concerns. So the point that I want you to explain to our viewers is, from the latest finance ministry review, the monthly economic review, what do you see they have said about inflation and the outlook?
So, I mean, the government and the RBI have, in our perspective, a slightly more optimistic view of output. So the projection is around 6.4%, and I know sometimes the estimate, in fact, even goes upper bound of that estimate is almost 7%. We have a more grim outlook. So we have GDP growth at 5.3% for FY24. So what's happening on the growth side in our perspective? One, consumption has somewhat improved in January from December, but again, if you compare it from November levels, it's sort of been flattish. On the other hand, we've had investments doing a bit better, investments and the industrial sector. But again, if you look at it from how it's performing vis-a-vis pre-pandemic levels, it's kind of been flat. Um, the two areas that seem pretty vulnerable at this point, one is the external sector. Now, we had the trade deficit number for Jan some time back, and one of the things we saw was trade deficit crash down to around $17 billion. And what got this crashing down? Well, one, imports fell, and exports fell. And both of these kind of give you a flavor of the extent of global and domestic slowdown which we are currently facing. And it's very interesting to see that actually the pace of fall in imports is steeper than that of exports. So imports is typically linked to domestic demand, right?
Right.
And exports is linked to global demand. There's, of course, price impacts also there. But I think what's interesting is that the fact that core imports have fallen so drastically, more than that of exports, kind of would suggest that the inherent domestic demand within the system is probably a bigger drag at this point than what global conditions are causing on the export side. The other point which I think is very interesting is we keep talking of services, and we keep talking of, look, I went on an aeroplane and seats were full, and I went to a place and all the hotels are booked. But when you look at the hard data on services, services was around 4 to 5 percentage point above pre-pandemic level as of mid 2022. This is the high frequency monthly data that has fallen below pre-pandemic levels currently. So what we've observed is that there was a post-pandemic boom in services, right? So the economy opened up, India's services did well, and now it's been slowly, sequentially moderating across the months. So overall, I think the global the overall conditions for India's growth, I think as of now they are stable.
Okay.
The reason why we are a little worried about going forward is, one, despite the positive global data that you see now, we still have in our base case a recession in developed markets that will hit exports, that will hit the capex. Mind you, overall private sector capex hasn't really improved as much as one would have liked for India. Secondly, let's not forget the RBI has hiked tremendously over the past 10 months, right? So almost every policy meeting, we've
Right.
seen 50, then 35, then 25. So the impact of this on growth and then on inflation has yet to be felt. So there's also the lagged impact of monetary policy tightening that's got to hit growth. So all those put together, even though India's fundamentals are pretty strong, uh, for this year, for FY24, we have a more bearish outlook at 5.3%.
Given that you spoke about the RBI, therefore, explain the reading that you did yourself of the Monetary Policy Committee minutes.
So the Monetary Policy Committee minutes increasingly look like the living room of an Ekta Kapoor serial. So you've got on one side the hawks, right? So this is four people out of six who are essentially saying that, look, we are going to hike policy rates. We are going to keep the stance withdrawal of accommodation, which essentially means that there's more tightening on the way. And then there are two out of six, two external members who've said enough is enough. This is where we stand. So what the minutes said, I think there are sort of three important things that sort of come out. One, there is little consensus within the MPC on how to read inflation, right? So this meeting happened in February. At that time, we had two readings of November and December for inflation, which was actually below 6%. Now, the Hawks essentially said that, look, we are not impressed by this. Core inflation is still high, and according to us, because core inflation is high, inflation is what they call durable, right? So it's whatever is falling is because of vegetable prices. Now, if you talk to the Doves say that yes, inflation could be a little elevated now, but we are pretty confident inflation goes down going forward. The second aspect is really the policy prescription. Okay, so the Hawks believe that we haven't yet done enough, and there's a risk of pausing before bringing inflation durably under control. On the dovish side, the external members essentially say that, look, you might be jeopardizing growth in the pursuit of bringing interest rates too high. So, in fact, Jayant Verma made this point very clearly in the point in his minutes. So the policy prescription is different for the two sets of people. But the third aspect, I think, and this is a little nuanced, which is it's easy to look at the minutes and say, oh, majority of the MPC is saying more interest rate hikes. But the nuance is that it also means data dependence, right? So a lot of the hawkish members, including Governor Das, are in fact saying, one, we are not going to give forward guidance, and two, we need to take into account the cumulative rate hikes that have happened so far. So you hiked by around 325 basis points. Now, this interest rate increase that has happened probably in the past 10 months, it has to now, the impact has to spread across the economy, across growth, and then to inflation. So let's wait and watch there, and let's react to data. So I think we are firmly in two camps, right? One camp is the forward-looking camp, according to me, which is the Davish members. So this is Dr. Ashima Goel, this is Professor Jayant Verma, who are essentially saying, look, we've done enough. Let's not overdo it, and let's pause here. And we are worried about growth later. We are okay with inflation. And then there is another wing that says, no, inflation is still a problem. We can't let it go. So we still have to be on a very data-dependent mode, and we have to continue looking at inflation cautiously, and don't worry about growth. Growth is relatively fine. So the MPC is essentially split. What this means for monetary policy is that the April policy meeting is going to be interesting. Now, most of the market thought that Feb would be the last meeting, but inflation surprised on the upside in January. So January inflation was 6.5%. Market was expecting 6%. Plus the minutes have turned out hawkish. So there will be a section of the market that are penciling in another 25 basis point hike in April. Our base case is still a pause. We have a 70% probability of a pause in April, so we are done with the rate hikes. But I guess the February data that comes out in mid-March for inflation is going to be important in terms of what the MPC decides to do in April. All said and done, we have at least two people out of six who are going to say no to further rate increases by the MPC.
What's your own sense? Another rate increase, if it were to happen, because that window or door has been kept open, uh, are we talking in about the same quantum of increases that we have witnessed, 25 basis points, or do you see a different approach that the MPC could take?
So that's a very interesting question, Siddharth, primarily because one of the things that, if I'm not mistaken, Deputy Governor Patra mentioned in the minutes was that look at the action and the quantum of rate hikes that we are doing as a sign of the stance that we are adopting. I mean, at this point, I think that there is. Uh, is it going to be 50 basis points? I think the answer is no. We've already hiked quite a lot. It would send a completely wrong signal to hike more than to hike in a 50 zone. I would probably assign lower probability to 15 basis points. Although the RBI has hiked in, I mean, can do whatever it likes. There's nothing stopping it from doing 15 or 25. But I think our base case currently remains paused. And if they do hike, I mean, I would imagine it would be around 25 basis points. But again, a lot of this will depend on whether in February we see inflation as high as January. Is core inflation as elevated in February, or was January a blip? So it's still fluidic, the situation for April.
What are the numbers that you are working with for uh, growth, including the next data release that is coming up?
So we are looking at 5% for around 5% for Q3 of FY23, which is the data that comes out. And yes, this data benefits from the services sector kind of rebounding. You also have the festive period during that point. But on the other side, the inherent industrial sector has been a weakness, has remained. So, we've seen it remaining relatively weak across. So it will be a mixed data point, but I think we are on track at around 5%, which sort of makes so FY23, we have it at around 7%.
One final question: by when do you think? Because the environment, if we were to describe it, has some amount of uncertainty. We know the broad direction, but we don't know the speed or the pitfalls ahead. At least the key ones. By when do you think there will be greater clarity? Would it be around when the monsoon has hit us and we know how the rain gods have been for the economy this year?
Well, Siddharth, one of course is monsoon, but the thing that we are really sort of looking very keenly at is not it's not India. It's in fact global. Right now, one of the things that has surprised is that data from the US has been relatively strong over the past couple of months, and so that means two things. There's some sections of the market who are saying, oh, well, you know what, a recession may not come. It might be a soft landing. But then the question that comes is, yes, China is reopening. Yes, even if the US does well, it's primarily in services. So it may not increase in India's exports because in terms of the export side, the merchandise side will still be lower. But the concern that one has is if global inflation remains high and the growth remains resilient, then central banks abroad, so Fed, for instance, would look at it and probably, in order to bring down inflation, be incentivized to push rates up higher. And if that happens, then it means tighter financial conditions for emerging markets, including India, and which means that you know, uh, there'll be weaker growth, which impulses that come later in the year. So I guess one of the things that we are looking very carefully, and it's a very interesting year to be an economist, is to sort of see that right? Growth seems fine globally now. Inflation seems still elevated despite a huge amount of hiking that has happened by central banks globally. When is this pivot going to happen? And what are central banks going to do to engineer this pivot? And once that pivot happens, what will happen to emerging markets like ours? So I think it's a very interesting year that way. And that's sort of the key question that I'm looking out for.
Absolutely, and when this phase gets over, perhaps case studies will be done, and the question that might be asked is what is the correlation uh, uh, between interest rate, the cost of money, and the embedded price that average customer has to pay. But we'll have to wait for that. Dr. Nandi, thank you very much for your time with us today. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of Easynomics. We'll be back with more. Do stay tuned in and do keep watching Business Television. Thank you very much.